So welcome everyone. This is our third in a series of 6 talks for this fall. It's sort of carryover from our 2020 sort of spring symposium that was unfortunately canceled back in March due to COVID. But I hope that you will find that these individual talks give us more time to kind of interact, and also we're able to record them for viewing later. So if you haven't already pre-registered for the upcoming talks, there are still 3 more after today, including a keynote talk this Thursday evening. So visit pollinationguelph.ca/upcoming-events in order to register for the next few talks. I will remind everyone that the talk is being recorded and the talks will be available on YouTube, usually within about 24 hours as the talk concludes. So if you happen to have missed the previous 2 talks or happen to miss another one coming forward, you can tune in later to our YouTube channel to watch them at your leisure. Do a big shout out to all of our sponsors. They've been very patient with us for having to cancel our symposium back in March and now to transfer their funding to the speaker series instead. So if you have opportunity to patronize these individuals or just give them a shout out on social media, they certainly appreciate that. I do want to quickly read our land acknowledgement statement because this is very important, especially in this day and age, to recognize that many of us are settlers on this land or visitors to the land. So Guelph is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron neutral people. We honor the original ancestors of this land and also offer respect to our Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Métis neighbors. We strive to be accountable by acknowledging this history and cultivating respect and our relationships with Indigenous laborers and the land. Now, I realize not all of you are from the city of Guelph or living in the city of Guelph, so I encourage you to consider the region that you're currently living in or visiting and your relationship to the land and the people, so there now and historically. As I mentioned, many of us are visitors on this land, and we like to acknowledge those that were here before us. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Erin Aults from the Royal Botanical Gardens. As a librarian and archivist at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Erin gets her to nerd out on old seed catalogues on a regular basis. Rich in botanical artwork, heritage and heirloom seeds, in the marketing heydays, the seed catalogues tell unique stories on our horticultural heritage. Erin loves the opportunity to bring these catalogues to the public while enriching their understanding of the environment and the influences of the historical seed houses of Ontario. So we're going to turn it over to Erin here. So a reminder, like most Zoom meetings, please remain muted and leave your video off. This will help to keep the sort of bandwidth down, help to keep everyone together and not kind of dropping out of Zoom. If you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to add them to the chat box. We'll monitor the chat, and at the very end of the presentation, a little bit of a chance for question and answer, and then we'll pose those back to the speaker, to Erin, as we go along. So just type your questions into the chat box as we go along. And one more reminder, don't forget to sign up for the next talks in the speaker series, because there's a lot of really good talks. Still, we're only halfway through the series, so lots, don't miss out. So Erin, if you want to share your screen. And we'll get started with your talk.
Hello, everyone. Victoria, can I confirm that you're seeing my screen?
Yes, I am seeing your screen.
Great. And everyone can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Victoria. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to apologize immediately. I have my text on one monitor and my slide presentation on the other. So if I'm looking off to what is my right a bunch, it's because I'm reading the text that I wrote. So thanks for joining me. As Victoria mentioned, my name is Erin Aults, and I'm the librarian and archivist at Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Ontario. I'm going to chat for a while about the history of gardening in Ontario and how seed companies affected the landscape. So I also want to start this talk with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. It has extra dimensions when I talk about the history of gardening and horticulture in Southern Ontario. Settlers are not the first gardeners. These lands have been walked and worked and grown by humans for their own needs for millennia. There's evidence of the depth of that millennia in the archaeological discovery of a notched projectile point, or what many of us may simply call an arrowhead, at Princess Point on Cootes Paradise in Hamilton, Ontario, that dates back 9,000 years ago. To briefly put perspective on that, the pyramids in Egypt are approximately only half that age, being built around 4,500 years ago. Princess Point on Cootes Paradise was also the home of the Princess Point people, who were Canada's first crop cultivators. Archaeological digs have discovered maize kernels that were grown on Princess Point as far back as 500 AD. Along with maize, the Princess Point people also grew wild rice in Cootes Paradise. There has been discovery of pottery from that same time period at middens, or garbage pits, with other evidence of human settlement, all from over 1,500 years ago. First Nations such as the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabeg walked the land that is now known as RBG. This land is within the land of the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 in 1793. This was between the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Crown. At RBG, we're aware of the long history of First Nations people on the land, and we hope to continue to work together in positive, reciprocal, and respectful ways for the good of everyone. I'm going to be speaking about settler gardens. So when European settlers started coming to Upper Canada, they were focusing on survival and growth. Sorry, let me actually move my slide presentation along. Here am I, back when COVID wasn't a thing, and I was at the Royal Winter Fair with a large squash. So when European settlers started coming to Upper Canada, they were focusing on survival and growth. Settlers' early gardens reflected that paramount need. Their garden was there to help them survive. They grew food and medicine. Here's an incidence of 1883 seed catalog from T.C. Robinson and Owen Sound that shows a new cultivar of grapes called the Jefferson grapes. Most of the plants that they grew were herbs, vegetables from Europe, and new food crops from the New World, such as potatoes, tomatoes, beans, and corns. Neighbors would exchange seed plants, they would exchange plants, and they would exchange knowledge for their garden kitchens, for their kitchen gardens. Many purchased or brought seeds from companies in Europe, and they would save seeds as well and share that among neighbors. Women would often offer plants as a guest when visitors come, and of course, seeds were occasionally used as barter. Early seed and nursery trade catalogs would be short lists of food plants. The earliest nursery list is William Cousted's list, published in 1827. This was in Upper Canada in York. He was the owner of Toronto Nurseries, and this 18-page catalog that was printed by William Lyon Mackenzie primarily listed apple trees for sale. He had several hundred apple trees for sale in this pamphlet-sized catalog. He was growing them along with Johnny Appleseed, as not for snacking apples, but for the delicious, fermented, alcoholic, and very popular hard cider. Food plants were a primary part of seed catalogs in this early years. Here's an image of J.A. Simmers, who is a seedsman in Toronto. He was a German immigrant. In fact, he was a German consulate for a time being with the Toronto consulate. You can see the focus on vegetables that he has here. So this was in 1892, and the next seed catalog that I'm aware of after William Cousted's is John A. Bruce's seed company in Hamilton, who started in 1850. The earliest seed catalog that RBG has is from the 1870s. Bruce was Hamilton's first seedsman. He started his business on King Street in 1851, purchasing a seed company that had started the year before, so he claims that he started in 1850. His early seed catalogs focus on vegetables and herbs. These short catalogs were often about 2/3 vegetables and herbs, with the rest being the flowers, insecticides, and fertilizers. In this early years, the fruit and vegetables and herbs were always at the forefront, were always at the beginning of the catalog, with maybe brief listings of accompanying plants that you could have for your more ornamental reasons. Starting in the 1870s, Bruce's catalog showed that plants were being cultivated in southern Ontario for our specific climate. This J.A. Simmer shows this as well, with some cabbages and tomatoes that were grown specifically for Hamilton area or more northern climates. One of the most famous one was the Unsworth melon, which was actually produced on Unsworth Avenue in Burlington, Ontario. And you'll see this pop up in multiple seed catalogs during that time. The plants were varieties that were developed in Niagara, Hamilton, Burlington, and of course Guelph at the Ontario Agricultural College. These included melons, tomatoes, and flowers, all designed for Ontario's weather and soil. One of the most popular was the Unsworth melon, and there was also the Livingston tomato that was created in Columbus, Ohio, and that had a lot of take up in Ontario as well. Medicinal herbs were also a primary sale. You can see here in this J.S. Pierce and Company seed catalog from 1892 in London that they say these herbs as being both medicinal and culinary. Here's one of my favorite images that showcases some of the vegetables that were being grown. This is the 1886 center page from the Robert Evans and Company. Centerfold has a whole new meaning in the work that I do. You can see here that there was a lot of tubers and bulbs and growth that was growing under the ground. You can see the amount of illustrations and time that they were putting into these illustrations. One of my favorite on this is the Swede turnip, or what was also known as a Mangel Wurzel, which is here in the far left. And these were mammoth. There would be 20-pound Mangel Wurzels, and these were used for feedstock. So from the 70s through the early 20th century, seed catalogs grew from a few black and white pages listing plants and prices to 100 pages plus that would be featuring these gorgeous color illustrations. These early seed catalogs relied on the sales of fruit, vegetables, and herbs for humans and livestock, and the bulk of their offerings were the food plants. They were growing a large variety of plants, creating their own cultivars of vegetables best suited for the environment. You might ask where it was that they got these seeds. Many seed merchants were immigrants. They had close ties to their European countries, and they would go on trips to Europe to see the latest plant cultivars grown and bring back seeds. Many of them would have their own growing areas or nursery grounds. Rosedale Nurseries, which I have a few slides of, was in Hamilton, and it's one such example. Rosemary was the nursery for John A. Bruce Seeds. It was owned by David Murray. Here is the Rosedale Nursery. You can list here, this is from the directory from the 1890s. All the different land that was owned by it. You can see in the upper half of it that David Murray is the superintendent, and here's the addresses that the Rosedale Nursery grounds were on. Because he was growing for John A. Bruce, John focused on him as the back page in his 1883. And you can see this large expanse of nursery that was created on Main Street East in Hamilton. And these were where they were growing flowers and fruit. They invited people to come in and take a look. They were doing experiments. They were selecting and hybridizing plants specifically for the Hamilton area here. This is now obviously a very urbanized area. And so it's fascinating to think that this went from forest to nursery land to European cultivated plants that were brought over and hybridized more, and now to streets and houses and businesses. Once settlers were able to feel more secure in their survival, the story of gardening in Ontario shifts away from botanical exploration and survival and crops for economic growth to beautification. As European settlers prospered, land became a symbol of privilege. You can see in these two images how much there was images of expansion and colonialism that were in the catalogs. In the catalog that's the Robert Evans on the right, you can see in the background train lines. And Evans, who was a Hamilton seedsman, he used the train lines as a means of dispersing the seeds all across Canada. They were going out to the west, they were going to the east, they were also going to Detroit and into the US as well. So trains were paramount to the distribution of seeds in Canada and to the success of many of these businesses. In fact, Steel Briggs, which is a company that was started in Toronto, saw Hamilton as being so central in the distribution, partly because of the access to Niagara and the access to all of these train lines, and of course, the harbor from Lake Ontario, that they started a second home here in Hamilton actually buying the Robert Evans business once he had died and his widow ran it for a few years. So they were seeing this as Hamilton as being a central distribution point. Many of the settlers still had very strong connections to Europe and wanted to bring some of that culture back to the New York. They did this by following the trends of horticulture and botanical explorations of Asia and Africa. Seed catalogs provide insight into this as well. One of the more horrifying discoveries I've found in one of the catalog, other than some racism, was the heavy promotion of fast-growing impervious vine kudzu. This was from a catalog in the 1920s. And if you're familiar with kudzu, you know that it's highly invasive in the US. You can see a number of invasive plants being promoted through seed catalogs that were again reaching across the country. And these were placed in prominent positions, partly because they were very successful and beautiful, and partly because they were exotic, people were more interested in buying them rather than the plants that you would see in the native land around you. Canadians were also heavily influenced by the memories and writings of gardens and estates from England. Some of Ontario's rich landowners even brought over gardeners from England and the rest of Europe to help them beautify their properties. So it was the British landscape ideals became part of the Canadian landscape ideals. Canadian horticulture was so dependent on British writing that our first book written by a Canadian on horticulture in Canada wasn't published until 1903. This was Annie Jack's book, Canadian Gardener, a Handbook for the Amateur. Some of the flowers that were being introduced from other countries and so were important to early gardeners were bachelor buttons, lily of the valley, fringed bleeding heart, and coral bells. And no story about early 20th century gardens would be complete without mentioning the importance of nasturtiums, sweet peas, asters, and evening primrose. Excuse me. You can see the sweet peas on the John A. Bruce catalog there. You can again see the switch from vegetables being primary, as they are in the Robert Evans, to a switch to flowers and the floral beauty as being a primary part of the catalog. One of the interesting changes for gardens that we now see is the gardens used to be a central feature in the yard. Castor beans or some other tall, exotic-looking plant was the central focus, with other flowers being planted behind it. Now we're seeing more perennial borders and this kind of thing rather than central placement. Along with flowers, one of the things the British landscape ideals brought were lawns. Lawn rose in prevalence in the early 1900s as a part of the privilege and land ownership. Stately entrances, lush green turf, all of it was important to wealthy folks who wanted to improve the appearance of their home and land. My apologies. Apparently I haven't talked that much since I've been in isolation. This image is from Steele Briggs. They were distributors of the Queen City lawn grass. Many many companies would be creating their own grass seeds and were very famous for distribution of it. Steele Briggs' main logo was 3 bags of grass seeds with a lion on top of it. So again, you have that impact of colonialism with the lion representing England and the grass, of course, being a representation of privilege. J. Simmers was a German immigrant who opened up a seed company in Toronto. He was a businessman, and he was also, as I mentioned, the German consulate. In his 1927 catalog, he sums up the general feel on lawns as writing, "A beautiful lawn with its close, velvety turf is a most essential feature in the adornment of our suburban homes. Without it, the finest flowering plants and bedding seem insignificant, while with it, handsome grounds are assured, even with no other adornment." In 1911, Howard and Laurie Alfreda Dunnington Grubb moved to Ontario from England. They were landscapers and plantsmen in England. They started their business here as landscape architects. Within a few years, after doing some work at many people's homes and for public gardens, they became frustrated with the lack of plants that they could acquire and use here. In order to supply better plants, they created their own nursery, and that's Sheridan Nursery, which many of you may be familiar with. It's still going strong in Mississauga, Toronto, and Markham. Sheridan opened in 1914 and became one of the best providers of trees, shrubs, bushes, grasses, and ornamental flowers in Southern Ontario, and probably in Canada. The Dunnington Grubbs went on to design and plant many of the major public gardens in Southern Ontario, including the Sunken Garden at McMaster University, as well as Gage Park, also in Hamilton. The two world wars then had effect on gardens as well. Lawns and flower gardens were ripped up for victory gardens. The victory gardens in wartime manufacturing and shipping changes resulted in seed shortages. The victory gardens also saw significant changes in the seed catalogues. There were many new varieties of vegetables yet again, and vegetables became a forefront. But the years after the war saw a loss in the variety of flowers, such as the sweet peas and nasturtium, that were available because they weren't being planted anymore, so they hadn't saved the seeds in order to continue that. They also lost the prominence because of the importance of vegetables during the recovery period. Of course, as more varieties of fruit, vegetables, and ornamental plants were developed, commercial producers began to favor disease-resistant, hardier hybrids. Canadian winters were very different from the European winters many people and plants were accustomed to. Plant hybridizers and government experimental farms, including the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa, began plant breeding programs to introduce plants able to withstand these cold, bitter, long winters. Hardy plants became a theme in catalogs, as demonstrated here by this McConnell Nursery Company catalog that states hardy plants for Canadian homes. And again, you can see in this image the importance of the lawn, and that the perennial plants on the side there are really the perennial borders rather than being the central focus. These hardy plants were roses, lilacs, and many other hardy species. This, of course, resulted in some of the issues that we're seeing today with ornamental plants, such as the loss of cultivars that were prized for their flavor or fragrance. This brings me to the final point on garden history, which really goes hand in hand with social and economic history. In 1957, they started to realize that this loss of plants was having an impact on the environment. So in this 1957 nursery catalog from Rowancroft in Streetsville, Ontario, which is now Mississauga, the Ontario Wildflower Society urges gardeners to grow wildflowers under suitable conditions to save them from the encroachment of civilization. So there became more of an awareness of the impact that urbanization was having on how gardens were surviving, how the impact that this was having on wildlife as well. And people continued to find gardens as a place of respite. The loss of cultivars, which was from the hardy plants as well as the just general movement towards different ornamental plants, led to an increased awareness in the importance of genetic diversity and renewed an interest in what we now call heirloom varieties. Emmy Blacklock, who was the woman who owned Rowancroft Nursery, was busy breeding hardy lilacs. She was a stellar nursery woman. She produced a lot of different cultivars of ornamental plants and worked some with the Dunnington Grubbs to increase the amount of ornamental plants available to the general public. Today's garden trends are also now shifting away from these lush lawns. Because these lush lawns require fertilizers and pesticides, they're having a greater impact than we realized. Many people are now in the process of ripping up their lawns to put in rain gardens, native plant gardens, or vegetable gardens. There's many seed catalogs in the 1970s that are showing some alignment with the Back to the Land movement as well. Some of the major prairie plant nurseries were started in the 70s, and they were seen as being very out there at that time, but are now becoming more and more generally recognized as being important. What I find so fascinating is that in the general cyclical force of nature, this COVID-19 pandemic has started another renewal of Victory Gardens. This past spring, there was an explosion of seed orders in many companies from William Dam in Dundas to OSC. The Ontario Seed Company were running out of seeds, and they weren't capable of keeping up with orders. I hope that this interest of renewal in gardening, horticulture, and food continues to grow. There's still many seed catalogs and seed companies out there that are selling seeds. And I hope that they continue to grow and continue to be promoted as they're doing so much good for us. So that's about the end of my talk. I do want to close with one of my favorite introductions from Seed Catalog. Maybe if I can get through it. This is T.C. Robinson, who is a seedsman in Owen Sound, and this is his opening line from his 1883 catalog. And I find it speaks so clearly to the timeless quality of hope and optimism we all feel from a garden in spring, as well as the business of gardening. Mr. Robinson writes, "Beneath the deep covering of the beautiful snow, my garden lies silent as if under the touch of death. But those who court the smiles of Dame Nature know that below the seeming shroud of securely repose, the germs of life in bud and root and sap cell that must spring into green leaf and brilliant flower and ruby fruit, when the returning rays of the spring monarch shall render their snow blanket no longer needful. But if we want a rich harvest of fruit in summer, we must expend a sowing of brains in winter. A copious chapter of strawberries and raspberries in July and August can only follow an accurate and liberal index of plans and thoughts in February and March. But I gave you plenty of preliminary talk last fall, so we can afford now to get to business." I will finish up with just a little bit about the archives that I run, which are the Center for Canadian Historical Horticultural Studies. They were started in 1979 by the RBG librarian at the time, Ina Brookman, and the Dunnington Grubb Foundation. We have 30,000 seed and nursery trade catalogs from 46 different countries. About half of those are catalogs from Canada. The bulk of our Canadian catalogs are from Ontario and Quebec, with a pretty strong holdings from about 1880 through 1960. We're continuing to collect catalogs, including ones just very recently published. We also have a rare book collection that focuses on horticulture and botany, including the Canadian Horticulturist, Canadian Florist, and Canadian Botanical Society, as well as Annie Jack's first book, and many others. I do want to emphasize that the volunteers who organize and manage the collection are life-saving. I haven't seen them in many months, and I do miss all the work that they do for me. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Erin. So yes, if people have questions, just type them in the chat box and then we'll pose them back to Erin ourselves. Let's move to the next slide here. Yeah, so the first question comes from Monique. Do you have a list of plant seed catalogs that have native plants in it? Are you sort of including that in your archives?
We don't. We do have a database of the seed catalogs that are from Canada and the international seed catalogs that are not the US. However, it's a home-built database, and we haven't separated whether or not they're native plants listed.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can add them to the chat box there on the bottom. I have a question, Erin. Did you ever notice an introduction of advertising for honeybees or pollinators in the seed catalogs? Like help pollinate your apple orchard, order some mason bees or order some honeybees?
Yeah, we do. There's the back of catalogs from about the 1880s through the 1950s would have a lot of beekeeping tools that were being used, books on it. There would also be insecticides and fertilizers. One of my favorite was for making roosters, neutering them, and it was a tool that you could use that the Seed Catalog promoted as even your 12-year-old boys can do this. So I found that one very humorous. There's a lot of entertaining and reminder of how starkly different things were then.
For sure.
One of my favorite seed catalogs from DM Ferry actually focuses on honeybees on the front cover, and this was from, I think, the 1880s. It's a beautiful, beautiful cover.
Another question, have you digitized the historical seed catalogs?
So we've been working on a digitization program for about the last 2 years. I have about 120 seed catalogs, maybe closer to 200 seed catalogs that have been digitized. We were focusing on the local area. So Hamilton, Burlington, London, Windsor, some Robert Owens or some T.C. Robinson from Owen Sound. The book scanner is actually quite difficult to deal with, so I've been a little slow, and of course I haven't had access to the scanner for the last 7 months.
Nancy asks, you can be recommended reading for learning more about Ontario garden history.
So Carol Martin wrote a book called The History of Canadian Gardening. There are several books that are on it. Pleasance Crawford is another excellent author that I would read. Those are the two main ones, Pleasance Crawford and Carol Martin.
And next question, does the RBG have a seed library?
We do actually have a seed library. It was just launched in February of 2020, so it wasn't the most successful time to launch a seed library. We're hoping to try it again whenever it is we're able to have people in the winter time. But do check back. We have a lot of native seed plants that we took seeds from that were from our properties, as well as a few of the cultivated ones that are older, that are heirloom plants. There were probably about 200 different seed varieties in the seed library.
Cool. Well, that's our half-hour mark, I think, there, Erin. So thank you very much again for your chat. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for sharing your questions and comments with us. I'm sure you can reach out to Erin if you have further questions. And so with that, I do a plug again for our next couple of talks in our speaker series. Don't forget to sign up, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.